Welcome to Echoes of History, a Ubisoft podcast brought to you by History Hit. I'm Dan Snow. Today I'm concluding my Arctic journey with the ultimate challenge, the search for the Northwest Passage. History's greatest explorers tried and nearly always failed to find a navigable route from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Just what made this route so hard to find? And how did explorers overcome the fatal challenges it posed? The shiver runs down your back like a sharp needle. It skitters down your arms into your fingertips like a spider. Manning the helm of your ship in this part of the world is like standing in an icebox. You stamp your feet to get the blood flowing, and you flap your arms in turn, making sure to keep one hand on the wheel at all times. Even the slightest accidental maneuver can be fatal amongst the dense ice floes of the north. Looking at the barren vista before you, the world seems devoid of colour. Everything's white. The overcast sky, the icy land, the mist on the horizon. Even the waters beneath you are so dark they seem like an empty void. It is so silent, so lifeless in this place. You wonder whether you have unwittingly sailed into the other world. The worst part of your voyage is you don't know where you're going. Of course, that is also the best part. Your mission is to sail into uncharted waters, to find a way through this inhospitable ice, to plot a course that countless others will follow. Travellers from all over the world with all kinds of purposes will sail in your wake. Should you succeed, your name will go down in history. Either that, or it'll go down with the ship. Just another lost expedition. As if the environment could read your thoughts, from the mist ahead of you emerges an eerie sight, the broken mast of a ship standing alone in the cold sea, the only memento of an ill-fated voyage, and the warning sign for dangerous waters below. Not wanting to run aground on the shipwreck, you steer away from the mast. You hope you steered in the right direction, and wide enough to dodge the wreck, but not so wide that you go off course or hit one of the equally disastrous ice floes. As you wait for your ship to clear the danger, you don't realise you're holding your breath until the moment has passed. When you gasp, the steam that erupts from your mouth reminds you of the deadly coldness that surrounds you. Part of you wishes you could turn back, return to safer waters and a warm bed. Another part of you relishes the challenge. Who will be the victor in this quiet war between man and nature? There's only one way to find out. So joining me on this voyage of discovery is the returning guest, historian and author Ken McGoogan. His books include Searching for Franklin, Lady Franklin's Revenge, Fatal Passage, and Dead Reckoning, the untold story of the Northwest Passage. Ken, great to have you on the podcast.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
So it's funny, several of Assassin's Creed games transport us back to North America in the 18th century. In particular, you got Assassin's Creed 3, you got Assassin's Creed Rogue, and they allow us, the players, to sail in the freezing waters of the Arctic or off the north coast of Canada, and indeed occasionally swim in it as well. The game gives the impression that everyone was kind of exploring. There was an excitement there. People are heading north, they're exploring. Was the 18th century a golden age of exploration, as well as on the western frontier of North, of the North American colonies? Was it also a golden age of exploration in the high north?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. They were all about exploration in those days, right into the 19th century. So actually, I personally have written more about the 19th century, while it all began in the 16th century. But there was an explosion into the 18th and then on through into the 19th. People were avid to find a route to Cathay, the riches of Cathay, from Britain, to China and India. And, they had good reason for that.
So it's a shortcut to Asia. Okay, that's the Holy Grail. And also, is there anything else of an economic value there? I mean, I know beaver furs were hugely valuable as well in the European market. So are there other reasons to head north?
Yeah, well, you're quite right about the beaver. That the Hudson Bay Company in 1670, and they were going up the river, the French first, and then the Scots took over in effect. And beaver hats were all the rage. And when something catches on like that, so they were exporting their beaver furs to Europe. That was an economic base that evolved out of Arctic exploration, where they realized after a while that, oh, maybe China's a little farther than we thought, but look at all these beavers here, and so they turned to that commercially. But of course, they kept on searching for that passage.
As you said, it starts early on. I mean, I'm struck that the English the Tudors seem to be more interested in heading to the far north than they were of heading to other parts of, I'd have thought, more clement climes in the mid-Atlantic seaboard, for example. So you got people like Martin Frobisher are heading up there. Some of the great names of Elizabethan seafaring, way up north, doing mining and exploring.
Yeah, Frobisher was one of the early ones in the 1570s. And he actually, when he landed on Baffin Island, he thought he'd arrived. He thought he was in China or some such. And he looked around and he brought back a couple of loads of rocks that proved to be, virtually worthless and ended up going into the roads. But yeah, so things began, essentially with Frobisher. And then Francis Drake, he tried to find a western entrance to the passage. Drake was going in on the east, and most of them were. But Drake went north like a couple of hundred years before Cook. He was in the 1570s, but they tried to keep his exploring quiet because, there was Spain and Portugal had the southern routes locked up. So that was why they didn't want competition if they found the Strait of Anian or the Northwest Passage. They wanted, it to be exclusively theirs as long as they could have it. So Drake's voyage remained as secret as they could possibly make it for a long time.
Yeah, so you got Frobisher probing from the Atlantic side. You got Drake let loose in the Pacific. He's sailing perhaps even as far north as Vancouver, and he tries to get into the Northwest Passage around the top of Canada from that side, but ends up going back the long way around. He goes back via Asia and the Indian Ocean and
yeah, but Drake
Africa.
Actually got farther. He got farther north than Vancouver.
Wow.
Yeah. He got right up. I haven't got on the top of my head, but he got well up there, and they kept it quiet because they were competing with Spain.
So we talk about explorers, but we should remember there are real world economic and strategic wins from finding these stretches of water, finding these routes from A to B. You can get your ships can make the journey quicker. You can exploit the wealth of Asia more effectively if there's a less journey time. Less of your cargo will spoil. But the problem with this Northwest Passage across the north of Canada, it's one of the most hostile places on Earth, right? How on earth did they even set about exploring that with the kit they had available at the time?
I've been voyaging up there fairly often because I sail with a company called Adventure Canada and give talks on the ship, an adventure travel company. I'm, intimately familiar with those routes up there. And the thing is, it still boggles my mind in those little wooden ships to be tackling those waters. Like in 2010, I was aboard, a reasonable sized ship when it went aground in the Northwest Passage. Because even now, it's not completely well mapped. But those guys in those little ships, well, of course they were having, whalers were up there, but they were all having, they expected a great many accidents and mishaps because the Canadian archipelago, as you know, it's, a real mess of islands. Trying to get through that, figure a way through that, well, it took them centuries. And then there was a little problem of the Ice Age. The Little Ice Age, and you have a hard time identifying how long it lasted. Some say the 1300s to 1870, but that was making things virtually impenetrable. So yeah, you did have all these icebergs, and it just was not easy to get through there under the best conditions.
Who's paying for these expeditions? Because we know that Elizabeth I of England, she was famously stingy with the money. I mean, are these government expeditions? Like Royal Navy or naval expeditions, or are they just individuals winging it?
Yeah, all these things. I mean, the early guys like Frobisher and Drake, they were oftentimes privateers first. They were out there piracy on the high seas, and then they realized, well, I get a little backing. The merchants in London, these guys will back us. So they had, better kit when they left. And so there were a number of different ways these expeditions could be financed, but they did cost a fair chunk of money.
So they've got no charts. The sea, as you say, that's hard enough navigating around when the water's there. There's a lot of ice involved, so it's an ever-changing seascape. You don't know if a passage is going to be open that was open the previous year, or it's got to be one of the toughest places on Earth in which to operate.
In a different way, I guess it's comparable to seeking out the source of the River Nile, and, the Amazon. These are hostile places. So there are a few places that are more difficult, on Earth than punching away through the ice up in the Arctic. Yeah, very, very tough.
You've talked about being there yourself, but presumably there's still problems that even 21st century technology hasn't overcome. We still haven't mapped these waters completely accurately.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. As I say, 2010, I was on a ship that went aground, and we had to be essentially rescued because it hadn't been charted, and it was a gorgeous day. We were sailing through at a good speed, almost near the end of the voyage, and then suddenly, bam, you hit a rock, that you had not been charted. And so we sat there, and eventually the Coast Guard came and got everybody off. And eventually they managed to float the ship off. But because it wasn't really charted, well, although there's an argument that it was charted and they didn't get the maps and all that. But essentially and ships are still going aground in the Arctic. You get in too close to shore and it's not detailed. So yeah, even now, the distances are vast and the challenges are many.
It's hard to even list the limitations that they had to deal with, whether it was the food that they were able to take, whether it was the fact they were no internal combustion engine, of course, so they were dependent on wind and current. They didn't know where they were. They didn't have obviously any form of GPS. Yeah, they had a very primitive way of estimating their position on the Earth's surface. And even if they had known where they were, they didn't know where that was. So it's just these guys. It's extraordinary, isn't it?
Oh, you're absolutely right. It's right into the 19th century. They were still having a difficult time establishing, in particular, longitude. Yeah, so they were able to do latitude much more readily, but they had a terrible time, figuring out where they were, because they didn't have contemporary instruments of any way, shape, or form. It was a bit crazy to tell the truth, but they were all, and this is what, one of the things that interests me about them. They were all obsessive individuals, the guys who led those expeditions. And that makes for an interesting character to write about, an interesting person to follow, because this guy is, he's obsessed. Henry Hudson, for example, a terrific example. In the 1600s, he's down there. He goes through Hudson Strait into Hudson Bay. The winter comes in, so he's closed in because you can't get out. The ice is too thick. Can't get back out the way you came. So you're stuck there over the winter without, you haven't got big woolen coats. You're freezing. You're freezing to death, first of all, and you're very hungry, but you get through that winter. Now, his men are saying, okay, we spent a winter here. Let's go back to England. But Hudson, he tried to fool them. He said, yeah, well, I don't want to go back to England. I want to finish the job that I came out here to do. Find a way. They thought they were going to go through Hudson Bay to the west coast. So he wouldn't quit. And that's why he ended up, they put him and his teenage son and 7 other men in a little boat and sailed away. Left him there. That's got to be pretty amazing. And that story goes on. May I just go on a bit about why it excites me?
Yeah, go.
So Hudson manages to get ashore and, in the small boat, and there's 7 men there. Now, the story is that Samuel de Champlain, the French explorer, was at the same time, more or less, coming in through the St. Lawrence. And I guess Hudson and his men ran into trouble with the native peoples. There was a bit of back and forth, and a lot of them ended up dead. All of them except Hudson's teenage son. But Champlain got word that someone had this English boy captive. Champlain went looking for him, but when he drew near the area, they wouldn't let him. They wouldn't let him go any further, which was extremely interesting. There's a book called God's Mercies by Douglas Hunter that really tells this whole story very vividly. But it shows the terrible things that could go wrong.
What started the Civil War? What ended the conflict in Vietnam? Who was Paul Revere? And did the Vikings ever reach America? I'm Don Wildman, and on American History Hit, my expert guests and I are journeying across the nation and through the years to uncover the stories that have made America. We'll visit the battlefields and debate floors where the nation was formed, meet the characters who have altered it with their touch, and count the votes that have changed the direction of our laws and leadership. Find American History Hit twice a week, every week, wherever you get your podcasts. American History Hit, a podcast from History Hit.
And so Henry Hudson was just one of these guys who sacrificed his life looking for that passage that they believe existed between the Atlantic and the Pacific. So joining Europe to China, to Japan, to India, like as a shortcut. So he is just one of many people who disappear on that mission. So he's one of many men who've disappeared into that northern vastness. One of the missions in the Assassin's Creed games is for the player to find the wreck of Octavius, which is the kind of legendary ghost ship, which also is lost in the search for the Northwest Passage. People will have heard of the Octavius. Is there any truth? Did Octavius exist? And is the wreck there? Come on, Ken, tell us.
I think you know the answer to that. No, there's no evidence whatsoever that the Octavius existed. But it did put me in mind of another wonderful hoax involving Henry Sinclair, who was said to have made his way to North America. It looks like there was some kind of something to gain by spreading these hoaxes. You know, I've got the truth here, and here it is, aggrandizing oneself. But I'm sorry to say that I don't believe the Octavius ever existed. Although I think what I've seen of that in Assassin's Creed is really quite compelling and wonderful to watch and be part of.
So what about some of the expeditions that are real, that actually did take place? We got England's first transatlantic expedition, John Cabot in 1497. That was Henry VII. I mean, that was super early on in the exploration of the Atlantic world, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah. Oh, that was very early. Well, another one that caught my eye was a Danish expedition by early 1600s, Jens Munk. Okay, he sailed out of Copenhagen with 64 men. And in the end, he was one of 3 men who got back. These guys, they sailed through Hudson Strait, and, winter was coming on. He's a wonderful navigator. He managed to land, to winter, get his ships up at Churchill and wintered over there. But the men started to die. And at that point, they had no idea why this was happening. I wrote about this in a book called Dead Reckoning first. And what happened was I came across an article that had run in 1973 by a writer named Delbert Young. And it hypothesized and speculated convincingly that, you see, Churchill is polar bear country. And Monk writes about shooting a polar bear and consuming it. Now, the thing about polar bears, like other bears, they carry this oftentimes trichinella, a parasite. We have Monk's journal. You look at what happened to these guys, the terrible illness that beset them, it fits completely with the idea that they were felled by trichinosis, because Monk was a veteran navigator, and he knew what scurvy was and what scurvy could do, and he was treating scurvy. That wasn't sufficient to do what happened to these men. He managed to limp back, but trichinosis was as yet completely unknown. And that actually led me to look again at the infamous Franklin expedition, which is one of the great mysteries of the 19th century. And people have been saying, well, we don't know what happened to the Franklin expedition. Some people say, well, there's no mystery there at all. Well, actually, there is a mystery, and that's why people have been looking at it, because if you compare the Franklin expedition to his contemporaneous Robert McClure expedition, McClure lasted a good year and more longer than Franklin did before panicking and seeking to abandon his ships. So, and people have speculated over the years and written whole books putting forth the idea of lead poisoning or maybe botulism, but scientists have poo-pooed that. But the one thing that I put together in my book, Searching for Franklin, was that like the Monk expedition, like the André expedition in balloons up into the Arctic, you start eating those polar bears, you're going to get this parasitic illness that will kill you over a period of weeks or months. And that, to me, is what happened to the Franklin expedition, like the Monk expedition.
Wow. So the polar bears will get you dead or alive. That's a terrifying
That's exactly it.
So you've got Jens Monk, who makes it back with three survivors. I mean, how do they manage to sail those, tall ships with all those...
He had one large ship and one small one, and he was a brilliant navigator. So it was him and a couple of other men. That's a good question in and of itself.
Just crazy. Then we talked about Henry Hudson. We've got characters like the famous Captain Cook, James Cook, who conducts some of the greatest voyages of exploration in history in the Pacific and the South Pacific in particular. He has a go at finding the Northwest Passage. He approaches, like Drake before him, from the west side, goes around Alaska, but he has to turn around, and that would prove to be his last voyage. He would meet his end in Hawaii. You've mentioned Franklin, the famous expedition, the loss of Erebus and Terror. Same as everyone else. They sailed into the Northwest Passage, very, very cold, but just very unlucky, weren't they, even by the standards of that Arctic Ocean. And they got frozen in over a winter and then over a summer as well.
They were plain sailing early on. They sailed out in 1845 and they proceeded in. Harry had shown the way in through Lancaster Sound, and he did a little exploring, and they wintered on Beechy Island, kind of right in the middle of the Canadian Northwest Passage. So they wintered there, and then when the ice began to break up, they sailed out again. They sailed south, but then they sailed into into the ice, and they spent another winter there, and then they were still aboard the ships, but people started to die, and they couldn't really understand it. There were a high percentage of officers, unusually high percentage of officers in relation to the number of crewmen who were dying. And people did speculate, well, they must have been eating something. Well, they did. The officers had a separate diet from the men. And the other thing is, you see, on Beechy Island, and I've been there like any number of times, I've been driven off Beechy Island by polar bears. There aren't polar bears on Little Beechy Island, which is actually connected by an isthmus to Devon Island. Devon Island is chock-a-block on the south coast with polar bears. So I have been driven off, seen them coming across this little strip of land to Beechy, where we've landed. So Franklin's there, and he's got this outpost, and you can still see the remains of this outpost overlooking the isthmus. You see, because you've got your tents pitched, and if you get interrupted by polar bears once, you might fight your way out and not like it. They come back again. That's when you set up that outpost, because you say, I want to have a lookout. Because what else are you going to be looking out for? You're looking out for these polar bears. So they shoot the polar bears, unlike what we do today. We get in the Zodiac and flee. They shoot the polar bears, and what they do, and what they generally did, they had all these barrels full of food. So they take the polar bear meat, the fresh meat from these polar bears they've shot on Beechy Island. And when spring comes, they've already got the meat aboard. They're feeling great. They sail south with the polar bear meat in those barrels. And the end result is, unfortunately, that's infected polar bear meat that soon starts decimating everybody who eats it, which is all of them.
So they disappear, and there's all sorts of fascinating evidence now by the Inuit that's coming out, oral historical traditions about what exactly happened to the last few men on that expedition, but no one made it back from that one. Robert McClure, you've mentioned, 1851. He's credited with discovering the passage. How does he do it?
Well, to me, that's a completely specious claim because he didn't discover any navigable passage. That was the original objective. I mean, here are the rules of the game, if you will. You got to be able to sail through the passage. He got trapped in the ice. He like Cook before him, tried to get in from the west, and he got in from the west, but he got trapped in the ice, and he's still trapped in the ice. He moved around a little bit, but he's stuck there. And just as he's about to send his sickest men off on some fantastical quest, you'll be okay. Rescue expeditions are searching for Franklin at this time in great numbers. One of them comes across McClure's note, finds the ship just before he sends everyone off. So what happens then is They're completely iced in. His ship has been since discovered at the bottom of the sea. And he travels by sled and hiking across the ice. So he travels overland. Now, you travel overland through an impassable strait. To me, that's not discovering any Northwest Passage, although by then the Admiralty was so sick and tired of financing these expeditions that they said, yeah, he's found the passage. Sure, he traveled overland, but yeah, that works. I don't think so.
Okay, so in that case, who's the unsung hero of the Northwest Passage? Who should we credit for the discovery then?
Well, I wrote a whole book called Fatal Passage, championing the Scot, or the Arcadian Scot, John Ray, who was traveling overland. He was a medical doctor working for the Hudson Bay Company. These fur traders as well. There was another one who did great work, Samuel Hearne, English guy in the 1770s, same time as Cook. By the 1850s, Ray is out there. He is the foremost overland traveler of all the explorers. He knew the secret. The secret was learning from the native peoples, and he was able to do that. He would say, well, why is your sled going so much faster than mine? Well, we're icing the sled runners, that kind of thing. And he was also a terrific hunter when he arrived from hunting in Orkney. He arrives, he doesn't, say, I'm a great hunter, and here's how we're going to do it. He says, well, how do you cache meat to keep it away from the wolves and so forth? He set out to learn from the native peoples, became the foremost traveler. So he's out in 1854. He was the one, now that was an extraordinary expedition. First of all, it was on that expedition, Ray encountered some Inuit. He saw a guy had a cap band. And he said, that looks like a Royal Navy cap band. Where did you get that? And so then came the story of, well, there was a ship went down in such and so place. Hard to describe where it was exactly at that point. And Ray said, that's really interesting. If you've got more of these relics, I'll pay very handsomely if you bring them back to my camp because, I'd like to see more. Okay, then he carries on. First of all, he's on the coast of Boothia Peninsula, which is opposite King William Island. No one's really charted this area before. And he looks and he sees, well, you know what? What I see here before me is young ice. And this ice must be melting in the summer. Okay, he's an expert, right? He spent years up there by now, 2 decades, poking around in the Arctic. And he says, this is young ice, and I see that there's actually a strait through here that, according to the maps from the Royal Navy that were done by James Clark Ross and John Ross, who amended them, but made a mistake. They closed it off. They said, okay, this is just a bay here. But it wasn't a bay, it was a strait. Ray found that strait, and that was the strait through which Roald Amundsen sailed when he finally became the first to actually navigate the Northwest Passage. So they had to come down through Ray Strait, and Amundsen explicitly credits Ray, said he was the one who pointed me in this direction. Because you get into that archipelago and it's crazy. You don't know, there's this way, you can go that way. So Ray was the one who identified Ray Strait, which was the key to the first navigable Northwest Passage.
What started the Civil War? What ended the conflict in Vietnam? Who was Paul Revere? And did the Vikings ever reach America? I'm Don Wildman, and on American History Hit, my expert guests and I are journeying across the nation and through the years to uncover the stories that have made America. We'll visit the battlefields and debate floors where the nation was formed, meet the characters who have altered it with their touch, and count the votes that have changed the direction of our laws and leadership. Find American History Hit twice a week, every week, wherever you get your podcasts. American History Hit, a podcast from History Hit.
And that amazingly, given they started trying to do this in the 1500s, or in fact in the 1400s with Cabot, and it's Roald Amundsen did it finally in 1903 to 06. And that's wild.
isn't it?
How many men died? I mean, do we have any idea how many expeditions there are? How many ships were lost on that search?
There have been a lot of different estimates. See, we see some people saying there were 70 expeditions. But in fact, in my book, Lady Franklin's Revenge, I went through just the ones that, John Franklin's widow, Lady Franklin, sponsored or orchestrated into existence. 35, just in that period, 1848 to 1859. She did 35 by herself, so we're well over 90 in all, that's for sure. She didn't finance all those. She financed about 5 or 6 of them. But, she drove the Admiralty crazy. She knew how to make things happen.
Tell me, today, when people talk about the Northwest Passage, is there like a highway now, a maritime? Do people go, oh, yep, you take a left here and a right, or port and starboard there and there? Or do people just thread their own way through the archipelago, this crazy patchwork of islands to the north of Canada?
That's a complicated question. I mean, there are ways to go through, but, the ice is unpredictable. And as I say, I sail with Adventure Canada, but so you set out, here's going to be the way we're going to go. But they're watching the ice all the time, and they've obviously got the resources to do that. And that passage there, that going that way, is blocked. You're not going that way. You want to go that way, but you're not going that way. So it still happens, like regularly, that you're turned back from one way or another. But they've got a lot of experience now, so they have a pretty good idea, and usually are able to make their way through. I'm talking about a window of opportunity, though. We're talking August, September, because apart from that, you're not going to be sailing through there. It's just not going to happen. There's still too much ice.
Is there still a sense of just how sort of, spooky it is? I mean, you look at the Assassin's Creed games, and there's a great eerie sequence in which a player explores a shipwreck scattered amongst the ice floes, and it's sort of supernatural almost, and you've got the stories of the Octavius, you've got Hudson's disappearance, you've got Franklin's disappearance. Do you think it still has that reputation as a place that can swallow up ships and expeditions?
To some extent, absolutely. I mean, those sequences are spectacular in Assassin's Creed with the ice and so forth. It's nowhere near that dramatic. I'll give you an example. I guess 2007 was the first time I got to Beechy Island. I wrote a book about Elijah Kent Kane, an American explorer who was there when they discovered the Franklin graves, the 3 Franklin graves on Beechy Island. So he describes, they were frozen in the ice. There were several ships frozen in the ice immediately offshore, and they sent sailors, onto the island, and one of them came back shouting, "Graves, we found graves." And so they located the graves on Beechy. That was in 1850. But he describes the ice, and Kane is probably the best pure writer of all the explorers. A lot of them weren't very good writers, and he could turn a phrase. So he described this fantastic ice scape, even though I kind of knew better when we arrived there the first time. Where's all the ice? We weighed anchor, some distance off, got in the Zodiacs, coasted right up onto Beechy Island. No ice anywhere to be seen. That was a bit of an eye-opener. I registered the change because in my mind, I still had it back when it was a landscape of pure ice. But you can still find that ice, make no mistake, especially in Davis Strait and off Greenland, because the ice fjord is spawning icebergs all the time. So you can still, if you head up north, up through Smith Sound and so forth, you can still encounter massive ice and get the idea of the awe that inspired.
So the 18th century parts of the night, they look pretty different to today.
Because, the little ice age was in full sway at that point, whereas now it's not. But there's still plenty of ice and plenty of unpredictability. But the ice has receded. Yeah, it's much more accessible than it was, not nearly so dramatic.
What's the legacy? What's the lasting impacts of these Arctic explorers, whether it's forging the Northwest Passage or the advances in cartography or the methods of staying alive in these extreme climates?
Well, all those things are good points, but the exploration of the Northwest Passage, and in particular, driven by the search for Franklin, that was when things reached their apotheosis. that opened up the mapping of the Canadian Arctic, and so is the foundation of Canada's claim to the North. They charted it. There it is. The doctrine of discovery. Canada exists in its current form, certainly on the north coast, because of this exploration. That to me is the greatest legacy of all.
And I suppose each explorer would build on the knowledge and the tough learnings of the previous generation, and whether it's food and clothing and equipment to take. So that there is the fact that you're able to go up there and survive now. I guess you're standing on the shoulders of those giants.
Yeah. So now we go up in a ship that's many times larger, even though it's considered a small expeditionary ship. It's many times larger than these little wooden tubs that these guys were going out in. And, there's a dining room with white linen tablecloths and fine food. This is a far cry from going in there just with what you can carry. I mean, the fur traders, they were overland able to hunt and find food. But if you go in there in your ship, and you're not really going any place oftentimes that's known for having any wildlife, depended on only what you can carry in, and oftentimes that wasn't very much.
We've both been looking at the Animus technology from Assassin's Creed, the gameplay, and if you could have that good a vision of the past, if you could go and relive that history, is there any particular moment from the Arctic expeditions that we discussed that you would want to experience?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I had a lot of fun poking around on that with Assassin's Creed. I love that parkour stuff, and I think I mentioned earlier the way the guy swims. It's really goes in the water. It's really I find it a lot of fun. But some of the moments that I would turn to, the things that draw me are the mysteries. I mean, the mystery, the Jens Monk mystery, the Franklin mystery. There was another one, Elijah Kincaid. He went up what is called now the northern route to the pole, and he got trapped there through a couple of winters. And he eventually had no choice but to abandon his ship and make his way with a couple of small boats, down along the coast of Greenland. But that was a wild expedition in and of itself. So there are these moments. And then Ray's expeditions, I mean, even before the 1854, he did one in 1851 that was pretty extraordinary. In fact, he got to a point surveying the coast of Victoria Island, and it's just across from King William Island, where Franklin died, where that expedition ended. And he tried twice to get through the ice, and he couldn't. He was a wonderful navigator, a wonderful sailor, but if you're dealing with ice, on that magnitude, you can't go through there. So some of those moments really stand out for me. It's not a triumphant moment so much. Although another moment I like is when Samuel Hearne, he's a fur trader. He'd been a sailor in the 7 Years' War, sailed with the fighting Captain Samuel Hood. He ended up joining the Merchant Marine and then joining the Hudson's Bay Company. They were going to set up a whaling situation. But he wanted to go north. He was sent north, but, wanted to go to find if you're going to walk north all the way to the coast, sooner or later, the theory was, well, if there's a passage there, he's going to have to cross it, right? This is the same time as Cook's coming up the outside, or very near. Anyway, so he crosses no passage. There's no passage there below the Arctic coast. But he gets to the Arctic coast, and that he was the first one to plant a flag in effect on the Arctic coast of the continent in 1771. So, and it was later that, soon afterwards that Cook figured out, well, I have to go up and even above that to find the western entrance.
We've been talking a lot today about all these Europeans who are trying to chart these waters, but as you've pointed out several times, there have been indigenous people living there for a long time, and it sounds like they were critical into ensuring the survival of those expeditions who did manage to make it back.
I wrote a book called Dead Reckoning that celebrates the indigenous contribution. I mean, even someone like John Ray, he was absolutely dependent on his translator, William Buck Jr. Because if you run into some people out on the land, you got to be able to talk to them. But if you don't speak Inuktitut and they don't speak English, he had his translator. Not long afterwards, Charles Francis Hall was up there. He had a woman named called Tucalido that did most of the translating for him. And then there was, short time after, and he and she collected the stories that enabled others to put together what had happened after, Franklin's men abandoned the ship. And then you had Charles Francis Hall. He was absolutely dependent as well on Tucalido and others. And there was a fantastic hunter, Tulagak, that they would never have been able to go where they were going without the native peoples. That's open and shut.
Well, thank you very much for immersing me in the history and talking through some of the great scenes that we play out on the Assassin's Creed games. I must say, for me personally, I'd love to go back and chart those final moments of the Franklin expedition and try and work out what happened to some of those poor souls. But thank you so much, Ken, for coming on the podcast.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's been fun.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Echoes of History. It's a Ubisoft podcast brought to you by History It. Next time, video game narrative designer Holly Nielsen returns to interview one of the people who worked on Assassin's Creed Rogue. She's going to find out how they approached turning history into entertainment and how they rose to the challenge of crafting a story where players control the villains of the series. And don't forget to subscribe and follow Echoes of History wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're enjoying it, I'm sure you are, you can leave us a review too. See you next time among the Echoes of History.